Hey everybody. Okay, I am back and I'm going to try to keep that like bright light from shining in everybody's face. Okay, so this is gonna be uh just sort of a one of these stream of consciousness, just blah any kind of videos where I want to talk about, you know, especially for people who are new to this, that are getting into typing and what to think about or how to approach typing, mainly different people and somewhat yourself. If you're still sort of wondering what your type is, um, and ways to think about it and also ways to not think about it. um, and I'm going to be making a lot of references to the different cognitive functions and what they're doing. And so I would recommend maybe watching the quick and dirty explanation of all the 8 different cognitive functions, just so you could see where I'm coming from when I'm talking about the different functions and what they do. Of course, reasonable people can disagree with my interpretation, and that's all fine. I'm happy to hash that out. Um, Okay. So, few things. I honestly don't even know where to start here. This is obviously not well planned out. Um, but bear with me and hopefully get something out of it. Okay. So, typing people, a few things. I mean, first of all, you have to remember, you have to think about it as it's both a right brain process and a left brain process. Um, and what I mean by that is the right hemisphere, what we typically refer to as the right brain, is doing things at a very sort of high level, um, sort of big picture. It's the forest, not the trees. You're looking at sort of the overall, what we call the gestalt, right? The overall picture, how all the pieces sort of make up a whole, right? And so looking at it at a very big picture kind of way, where the left brain, the left hemisphere, is doing more of an analytical, breaking things into discrete pieces, and it's looking at the trees instead of the forest, right? um, and when you're typing people, the you want to keep in mind that you want to sort of use both parts of your brain. And when you see, especially people who are sort of new to this, the biggest breakdown that I see is they're either too left brained about it or they're too right brained about it, right? And so some people might be too left brained where they're over analyzing everything, and they're really breaking everything down into into the individual functions. And they're like, well, is this person an FE user or a TE user? Are they NI-DOM or are they SI-DOM? That kind of thing. And they get way too analytical and they sort of miss the forest for the trees, right? Um, where other people might be too right brained about it and they're sort of focusing too much on the big picture and they're sort of ignoring the individual functions and sort of ignoring the analytical part of it. And they sort of focus too much on sort of the stereotypes or um, sort of their vibe that they get from people, without sort of breaking it down and explaining why you know they think somebody is an INFJ or not an INFJ, because they just don't give they don't give me an INFJ vibe, right? And they don't act like all the other INFJs or what I've sort of built into my mind, the way an INFJ sort of comes across or the vibe that I get from them. without sort of explaining, okay, well, why, right? Is it because um, they've got too much FI, that kind of thing. Um, and again, on the other part, the other part of the spectrum, people could be too analytical about it, where the like, oh, that person's clearly an INFJ because look at all the FE they're using, or look at all the NI they're using, um, and not taking into account sort of the context, right? Um, where, yeah, somebody might be using a lot of NI in the video clip that you're watching or something because they're doing an NI task, right? And so they come across as very NI, right? Or just every time you see them, it's in a particular situation where they have to be using FE. And so you might come across thinking, oh, wow, that's a real heavy FE user, but not thinking of the fact that, it's sort of context specific, right? Maybe when they go home, they're like, oh God, thank God I don't have to use any more FE, right? And they go back into their little FI world. Um, so, so the first thing to keep in mind is try to use both sides of your brain. Look at it from the big picture and look at it from the analytical side as well. Um, okay, and to me, I think probably, especially if you're first starting out, I think the easiest way to approach it is to maybe start with the right brain part of it and try to get an overall sense of the gestalt of each type. Um, Now, 15 minutes from now, I might be contradicting myself and starting to talk about, okay, you also have to use the left brain. And that's sort of the point that I'm making, is you have to sort of balance the two. But I do think starting off with sort of the gestalt, right? What what makes, what sort of vibe do INFJs give you? What sort of vibe do ESTJs give you? Um, Without sort of focusing on any particular cognitive function right away, but just sort of their overall vibe. And again, you don't want to get stuck just doing it that way, but it's a good way to start. Um, and to me, I think one of the one of the good resources is a channel that I mentioned before, which is Dear Kristen. I'm pretty sure, yeah, it's either Dear Kristen or Me Kristen. I'm pretty sure it's Dear Kristen, and she is an ESFP. Um, and does a lot of funny skits about the different MBTI personalities. They're all in, and she plays each of the different personality types, or the different people with different personality types. And because she's an ESFP, she's like, really good at playing the different types. Um, Now, of course, it's very cartoonish, right? It's very stereotypical, but that's by design, right? It's sort of like when you go to a carnival and there's people sort of drawing those little cartoonish sketches of you. And, if you've got sort of a big nose, they'll make a really big nose. Or if you have messy hair, they'll make really messy hair, and they sort of over embellish, or they over exaggerate, your different features. And that's what makes it sort of funny and cartoonish. And that's, of course, what she's doing when she's playing these different types and putting them in these different situations. She's over embellishing, you know, the 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 different types and sort of their unique characteristics, right? And that's what makes it funny, right? Because it's sort of funny because it's true, but it's also sort of funny because it's not exactly true, right? And that's the humor behind it. And but what she does a really good job of, and I don't even know if she's doing this consciously or not, but what she does a really good job of is she over exaggerates the dominant function, right? and then she also makes them completely oblivious to their fourth function, right? So if it's an INFJ, and she gets some good digs in on the INFJ, she sort of over exaggerates their sort of living in their own little world, their little NI world, um, and being completely oblivious to sort of what's going on around them. In the outside world, or if it's like an INTP, they're she over exaggerates their introverted thinking, and then they're completely oblivious to sort of the FE kind of, part of the world. It just like, and not only that, not only are they like completely oblivious, but they don't want to engage in it. So I would definitely recommend watching those videos because, of course they're not accurate, right? But but they do give you a really good sense of the vibe of the different types in this very exaggerated way, right? And then if you could start off with a very exaggerated view of the different types, then you can start narrowing down sort of the nuances, right? And then sort of shifting more into your left brain part and thinking a bit more analytically, like, okay, what are the different functions that are being over exaggerated here, right? Like sort of, again, sort of the big nose in the cartoon drawing, and then what's being underplayed, what function do they seem to be oblivious to. Now I will point out that she started using the standard MBTI framework and not really making them oblivious to their polar function so much, but it's really their fourth function that she makes them oblivious to. But it still works, it still totally works, and it's funny. Okay, so getting a sense of a vibe there, and and also just sort of perusing just sort of the memes that are out there. Again, it'll sort of give you a vibe of how do INTJs typically come across. And yes, it's an exaggeration, yes, it's a stereotype, but it does start giving you this sort of gestalt feel of the different types. Okay. The other thing to keep in mind, especially for those of you who are sort of self-typing or, curious about your type, one thing to keep in mind is if you're at this point where you're watching videos about cognitive functions and sort of this analytical breakdown of the different types, it's too late for you now to be doing sort of the online standard like MBTI type tests, right? Or inventories, because you know too much right now, at this point, and it's too easy to game the tests or the inventories to get a result that you want. And I'll give you my personal example. When I first started getting into this years and years ago, I was convinced that I had to be a thinker. Like, it was just, I had the academic background and just sort of the, my job is very TE oriented. And, so it just, for whatever reason, because of my background, because of what I thought about myself, I was just absolutely convinced I was a thinker. And so every time I took one of these tests, no matter what website it was on, I knew, when they're asking you sort of, are you a thinker versus a feeler type of question? And I'll just give them the answer that makes me come across as looking at like a thinker. And I even did like an official MBTI test with like an official MBTI practitioner. But again, by that time, it was just too late. And so, of course, I came out INTJ because I knew, the questions that they were asking um, whether they were towards thinking versus feeling. And so I ended up scoring really, really high on the T because that was sort of the way I wanted it to come out. Now, my own little NI pet theory about that is, TI is my third slot. And like I like to say, that's sort of your gold star slot. That's sort of like what you pat yourself on the back when when you do a good job using that function. And so I think a lot of mistyping, and I don't have the data to support this, but it's just my theory. A lot of mistyping comes from whatever your third function is, you probably think that that's like a dominant or maybe secondary function. Because you sort of take so much pride in it. And so if you're an INFJ, it's probably a pretty good that you'll come out as a INTJ or something because thinking, disregarding TI versus TE part of it, but just thinking, you like to think of yourself as a thinker, right? Because you pride yourself so much on your TI. And so it really wasn't until, so I would sort of bounce around. Am I an INTJ or an ENTJ? And I'm sure I'm going to get comments that, oh yeah, you're totally an INTJ. I'm not. I get it. But when I finally did the polar testing with talking with famous Eric over at Talking with Famous People, that's when it finally clicked. I was like, oh yeah, it totally makes sense. Okay, TI, NI, right? So I still get to pat myself on the back for being a TI, quote unquote, TI user, or having that in the front stack. But everything else just sort of like fell into place. Now, getting back to the left brain versus right brain view of things, when I would sort of focus on the left brain part of it, sort of the analytical, like thinking of the cognitive functions, again, I wanted to think of myself as a thinker. And so, I would just sort of have this sort of interpretation or this general understanding of, here's how I think it works for an INTJ. And, and sort of convince myself that, okay, this is how my function order works. But every time I would see an INTJ, and my right brain is sort of watching them and processing them. I'm thinking, I am nothing like these people. Like, I don't like their vibe is nothing like my vibe. Right. And so the trap that I fell into, and I see a lot of people do this, especially when they're sort of figuring all this stuff out, is I was just convinced that everybody else was wrong and I was right. Okay. Now that's a very NI Dom kind of attitude. And so when I would see somebody who was, on a YouTube video and they claimed to be an INTJ, or somebody else typed them as an INTJ, and I would see them, I'd be like, well, that person doesn't act anything like me. Like, I don't get the same vibe from them that I think my vibe is. So either A, I'm completely wrong about what my vibe is, or B, they're wrong. And so that person's not an INTJ. They're clearly an ISTJ, right? So another lesson I would underscore here is, if you constantly find yourself thinking that everybody else is wrong and you're right, that everybody else out there is mistyped, and you're the only person in the world that is correctly typing people, then chances are you're probably the one that's wrong. Okay. So if, every time you see a video and, they claim to be an INTJ and you're just like, well, I'm an INTJ and I act nothing like that person. So that person must be wrong and I'm totally right. If you find yourself constantly doing that, then there's probably a pretty good chance that maybe you're the one that's wrong and everybody else is right. Now, that being said, I do understand there's a lot of people out there that have clearly mistyped themselves or been mistyped by somebody else, and they made sort of a YouTube career out of claiming to be a type that they're kind of obviously not. So I do understand that not, you know, that there are plenty of people that are sort of mistyped or just thinking about it the wrong way or whatever. But, so you have to sort of balance that. You have to appreciate the fact that, yes, there are going to be, you know, some people that are wrong or have made an error out there. But if you constantly find yourself, you know, disagreeing with whether or not, especially if it's like the type that you think you are, right? Like if you think you're an INTJ and every time you see somebody who claims to be an INTJ, you're just like, oh, they're wrong, right? Because I'm nothing like that. Or when people describe an INTJ in sort of this gestalt kind of way, that they're, sort of robotic or, in sort of making stereotypes or cartoonish representations of them. And you're just like, no, that's not true. They're just not seeing the nuance. No, they're probably right. They're probably right in their assessment. And there's a good chance that you're wrong. So if you're sort of doing the self typing or you're trying to figure out like how to type other people and you constantly are, have this sort of TI battle with everybody where you think everybody else is wrong and you're right, or kind of an NI battle as well. Maybe take a step back and sort of reassess. Okay, I think I've hammered that point up enough. Okay. The other thing to keep in mind, and I'm going all over the place here, so just sort of bear with me. The other thing to keep in mind is, MBTI came out as sort of this there's this proliferation of psychometrics back in like the 1940s, 1950s kind of era. And it's when they started, and a lot of it was, the army, the military, wanted to sort of pick the best soldiers. And so, they started coming up with things like the IQ test, like trying to figure out, quote unquote, general intelligence. And MBTI and personality tests started coming out around then because they were trying to use psychometrics to sort of classify people for the military, and then that sort of crept into the workplace because it was just it was a very different time, just sort of in psychology, where people were, I guess, sort of hyper rational about things, and trying to come up with ways to, or hyper empirical, and trying to come up with different ways of measuring people to basically either filter people out that shouldn't be in the military because their IQ is too low or they had the wrong personality type or whatever, or to filter people out of particular jobs because they had, they just weren't the right personality type for that job. And, you don't put them in that job, you put them in this job. And obviously MBTI has sort of evolved with the times and it's sort of softened that approach. But that's sort of where all this psychometric stuff came from, and you have to keep that in mind when thinking about typology and all the descriptions and everything, because what MBTI was trying to do was just say, look, we've got this measurement, we've got this standard. It's just like if I wanted to measure this table, I would just pull out a ruler and measure the table, right? And, we've got standard ways of measuring things. And nobody can really, if the ruler says that this is 2 feet wide, nobody can really debate that, right? We've all agreed here's, this is the way that we measure tables or lengths of things. And so with MBTI and intelligence tests and all that kind of stuff, there was just this, you know, attitude or just sort of way of thinking that, like, okay, we have come up with the standard, and we are just going in, and everybody is just going to accept the standard that we've given, right? So if somebody takes our test and comes out as an ESTJ, then they are an ESTJ, period, right? There's no like kind of hemming and hawing. It's just our test, has a specific function, and that is to put people in, to measure personality in a way and put people in the different categories. And so MBTI was sort of this like secret sauce, right? They didn't want people to sort of know about it going into it, because they didn't want what I was doing, trying to game the system so that you come out as one thing versus something else. Like an intelligence test, I used to give these things all the time to different types of people. The intelligence tests are very hard to game, right? You can either do it or you can't do it. But personality tests obviously are notorious at being able to game it, right? So if you go into it and you think, okay, I think of myself as a thinker, I'm not a feeler, it's very easy to game the test, okay? So because of that, MBTI is very secretive, and with their tests and their inventories and everything. But also you have to just realize that they are just basically treating it like a ruler. And if you come out with as an ESTJ, then they've got that description of you, that description of your type. And and that's just kind of the way it is, right? Like that's how you come out on their test. Okay. So what's the point I'm getting at here? The point is to not rely on the type descriptions to try to back your way into figuring out what your type is, because it goes in one direction. Okay. And what I mean by that is similar to if I said all poodles are dogs, but not all dogs are poodles. Okay. So that sort of logical way of thinking about things. So you could read these type descriptions, and let's say it's like an INFJ, and you'll see a type description that says INFJs are very, very loyal people, but they're very quiet, and they'll only speak when or they like to observe the situation, and they'll only speak when they think they've got something to contribute to the conversation. Things like that are sort of high level right brain kind of descriptions. But that could be true about lots of different types, right? Like, you'll see something that says INFJs are very loyal. And you might say to yourself, well, I'm very loyal. INFJs tend to have, a small number of friends as opposed to a large number of friends. Well, I have a small number of friends as opposed to a large number of friends. INFJs would rather sit at home reading a book about psychology than going skydiving. Well, I would rather read a book about psychology than going skydiving. So I must be an INFJ. So again, that's not the way to think about it. That's sort of going backwards. Um, because again, all poodles are dogs, but not all dogs are poodles, right? And so, you could say all INFJs are loyal, but not all loyal people are INFJs, right? So don't just look at the type description and say, well, okay, well, you know, I seem to be that type. And not only just the type descriptions, but when people are talking about INFJs, just like how INFJs are, well, yeah, I'm kind of that way too. So I must be an INFJ. It could be true, but it's not necessarily true, right? So don't fall into that logical trap. Sort of the descriptions and everything is sort of like, okay, once we figured out your type, then the MBTI people, once the MBTI people have figured out your type, then we're going to give you sort of a description of that type. But it doesn't work the other way around, right? Can't just sort of read the description and then sort of backtrack your way into saying, oh, I must be an INFJ because that seems that all that stuff applies to me. And I see that sort of logical fallacy sort of creep up all the time, um, in very sort of specific, nuanced kind of ways, where you know um, people will see somebody in especially when somebody claims to be an INFJ or something, and people don't think they're an INFJ, and they'll just be like, well, this person seems very outgoing, or very talkative, or very this or very that, and so therefore they must be an ENFP or maybe an ENTP. Without taking into account that maybe INFJs can be talkative too, right? Or maybe INFJs can be outgoing too. Um, so don't fall into that trap, where you notice something about somebody and then sort of back your way into what type you think they are, because you know ENFPs are talkative, and this person's talkative, so they must be an ENFP. That's just sort of faulty logic, and not only that, but it just gets you sort of sidetracked and um, hard to really sort of figure all this stuff out if you're constantly doing that. Um, okay, what else? There's a bunch of stuff I wanted to raise. Um, yeah, the other thing, sort of similar trap that I see a lot of people fall into is they are too hung up on mannerisms. So things like, well, that person looks up and to the left every time they make an answer, or, you know, that person's very, just sort of quiet. Um, just sort of these like behavioral mannerisms without really tying it to any specific function or anything, but just sort of like INFJs are quiet and this person's quiet, so they must be an INFJ, that kind of thing. Um, Now, mannerisms are not cognitive functions. Mannerisms are things you pick up basically from your parents, right? And I've got a good sort of personal story about this, where my parents were divorced when I was very young, and so I and then they sort of moved to different parts of the country. So I was never really I after a certain age, I was not really around my dad a whole lot until I got older. Um, and so there was this long stretch of time where, he was living on a completely different part of the country and I just didn't see him. However, when we did eventually sort of like hang out, um, we I noticed that we had a lot of the same mannerisms. Like, we rub our hands when we're excited about something, or, just things we do with our hands, or the way we wear our hair or clothes, things like that. And we are not the same personality type, right? Um, and the reason I get into this is, it's just a good example of, like, those mannerisms. Like, maybe I picked up when I was a little kid. Maybe it's just genetic, who knows? But there's just these very, very funny things that, he does, that I do, um, that, just sort of stuck out to me. But again, we're very different personality types. Um, and so it's just my way of saying, don't get hung up on the mannerisms. Mannerisms can come from a lot of different things, and they aren't necessarily telling you anything about the functions. Um, Now, what do I mean by mannerisms? That could be a large sort of range of things, but you kind of know it when you see it. Use your right brain to think about that. Now, that being said, what should you be doing? Now that we've talked enough about what things to try to avoid. Well, number one, again, sort of develop sort of your right brain vibe. And then once you start getting sort of a vibe of the different types, be be cautious about it, right? Sort of proceed with caution. Um, because you don't want to rely too much on it, because then you turn into one of these people where, you see 10 seconds of somebody on a YouTube video, and they claim to be an INTJ, and you watch 10 seconds of them and you're just like, oh, there's no way that person's an INTJ, because they don't give me an INTJ vibe, right? Because your vibe is very, it's a very quick decision. Um, you know, give it some time, right? And there are a few people out there where they claim to be like an INTJ, and like I would watch like their video, in the first 30 seconds I'm like, there's no way this person's an INTJ. They're totally an ESFJ. But I would stick with it, and I'd keep watching. And the more that I watched, the more I realized, oh, this person really is an INTJ, right? So I guess another sort of lesson is to, especially if you're trying to learn how to type people, trying to learn how to get a vibe from people, um, and you watch videos where they claim to be a particular type, like an INFJ or an INTJ or an ESFP, you know, give it time. Give it time. Let it sink in. Or don't make, a quick decision off of a 30-second clip. Because you have to keep in mind that, even if somebody's an INTJ, if they're making a video, and and like their whole career is off of their YouTube channel or whatever, they're probably going to try to be a little bit more engaging, when they're making their videos, because they want people to watch them, right? They want people to like them. And so they might be trying to be a little bit more engaging. Or when you watch typing videos, um, you know, somebody who ends up being typed as an INTJ might first start being a little bit more engaging, a little bit more bubbly than you would expect an INTJ to be. But that's, they're in a new situation. They're kind of overcompensating, right? Give it time. Give it time. Um, and also be aware of the context, right? Um, Again, if somebody is an INTJ and they're making a YouTube video, they are probably going to try to be a little bit more engaging than an INTJ would be if you just ran into them in the break room at work or something, right? where they don't want to talk to you, um, or an ISTJ or whatever. And another thing to do, so once you start sort of developing your ability to sort of get the vibe, but also keeping it in check and not relying on it too much, right? Don't rely, especially you INFJs and INTJs out there who just like totally rely on your NI impression of things. Keep in mind your NI is not always right. Okay. Give it some time. Give it some time to sort of take in as much information as possible. Because I can't tell you how many videos and different YouTube channels I've watched where the person claims to be an INTJ, and again, the first 10 seconds, 30 seconds, I'm just like, there's no way this person's an INTJ. And then I just keep watching and watch more videos, and I'm just like, oh yeah, they totally are an INTJ. And then I'll, sort of rethink my initial impression, and I'll just be like, well, they were just trying to be engaging, right? Because it's a YouTube video or whatever the situation might be. And also, when you're, engaging in like trying to type, who's Bill, is Bill Gates an ENTJ or an INTP, that kind of thing. Try to be as non-committal and as skeptical as possible. Well, skeptical of your own decision, or your own take, right? Because Bill Gates is, because if you watch Bill Gates in an interview, if they're asking him a bunch of TE questions, like how do you run your company, or how did you know, make a profit this year, or whatever, just a bunch of TE things, he's going to give a TE answer, right? And you have to understand the context. And just because he gives a TE answer and maybe talks about some TE thing for 20 minutes straight, because that's the context of the interview or the context of the speech or whatever you're watching, keep that in mind, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that he's a lead TE user, right? You want to watch somebody in a lot of different contexts, as much of different contexts as possible, or different situations, to really get a sense of them. Because if you just focus on, you know, a 10-minute YouTube video and then come out and be like, oh, that guy's totally an ISTP, or that guy's totally an ENTJ. Maybe your vibe, or your sense of vibe is strong enough to get that. But also keep in mind, okay, maybe they're just turning on this function because that's what the interview requires, or that's what this particular context required. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're dominant in that function. Now, that being said, if they're clearly lacking something, right? Like clearly lacking FE, or when they engage in FE, it kind of comes across as a little off. That might be something you want to maybe hang your hat on, right? You want to be looking for the polar stuff. You don't want to be looking for the dominant stuff, or the secondary function stuff, or even the tertiary function stuff. You want to be looking for the polar stuff. You want to be looking for two things. Number one, if they're asked to sort of give a TE answer, do they sort of shift it into more of an FE answer? Like, the interview asks, what new product lines or markets did you enter into this year? Sort of TE business type question. And then they shifted into, well, I just had this really good team of people, and I just surround myself by good people, and they give me good, input, blah, blah, blah. And now all of a sudden they took that TE question, they switched it into an FE question. Or, oh, that's such a good question. You're doing a really good job interviewing. Like, you just see it, right? And if they're sort of trying to avoid the TE, engaging in TE or engaging in SE or engaging in NE, you can kind of see it. And the more you get into this, the more you do this, the you'll sort of hone your skill at picking up on that kind of stuff. But again, you got to see it in a lot of different contexts. You have to see them. Don't just take the first 10 seconds or 20 seconds of an interview and come up with a rock solid conclusion. Maybe you're right, but be don't just trust your NI all the time. Especially you INFJs and INTJs out there. Okay. Let's see here. Going back to the MBTI thing and how, MBTI thinks about this a lot differently than we might, because I mean, you got to think, they're basically trying to give the SJs of the world, the ESTJs, the ISTJs, the ESFJs, and the ISFJs. They're sort of the worker bees at companies or in the military or large organizations. And they like when somebody just tells them, okay, you're an ISFJ or this person's an INTP. And now they have a nice answer that's tied up in a bow, and they don't really have to, you know, think about it too much. They can just use that information and act on it, right? And that's essentially what MBTI is trying to do, is say, look, don't look behind the curtain, just trust us, right? If we give this person a test and they aren't gaming it and they're being honest with their answers, then, here's what they are and proceed accordingly, right? And especially the ESTJ, anybody who's sort of a TE user, they're just going to say, okay, that's the information, that's what they are, and we're gonna use that and we're gonna move forward, right? They're not engaging so much that TI of like, really, that sort of skepticism. Like, a lot of really heavy TI users are going to be the INTPs and the ENTPs out there, where they're going to be a little bit more skeptical. They're just going to sort of take it as a data point and move along and incorporate it, and however it works into their system. um and so that's essentially what MBTI is doing. And that's why, when you read the personality types and the type descriptions, they try to make it as general as possible, give some specifics so there's something there, something to work with. But they also don't want to offend anybody, and they don't want to make anybody feel like a total outlier. So the descriptions could be read in a way that sort of apply to everybody. And obviously that's the big knock on MBTI and personality in general, is people will see these personality type descriptions and just be like, well, that could apply to anybody, right? And there's some famous psychology experiments out there where they just randomly gave people a description, and and then gave them a test, and then but it didn't matter what result they got on the test. They just got sort of a random explanation of their type. And of course, everybody thought, oh, yeah, that totally applies to me, because it says all these positive things about them and everything. And people like hearing positive things about themselves. And so, very famous. And so that's why a lot of people who don't take the personality stuff too seriously, or are very skeptical about it, because you do get results like that. And so, again, just sort of reading the type descriptions, and you don't want to make too many conclusions off of that, because they are written in a way that is relatively positive. They don't want anybody feeling like an outlier. And you're just naturally going to sort of assume, like, okay, that seems close enough to me, so that must be my type. And so instead, again, you want to be a little bit more left-brained about it now. You want to be a little bit more analytical, engage in some skepticism, and start thinking more analytically, like, okay, do all the functions and the way they're sort of stacked seem to make sense to me, right? Especially the polar function. Does that does it make sense that that is the one cognitive function that I have the most difficulty with? Um, and so that leads me to my next tip on things to do is watch people who are good at typing. And I use talking with famous people as an example of the time. But if you really want to get into the analytical part of it, the left brain part of it, watch the typing videos. The typing videos and also sort of the type police because he gets really analytical there sometimes. But the typing videos in particular, because you'll see him it's hard to pick up on the first few times you watch it, but you watch enough of them, you get a sense of the different questions he's asking and what function he's sort of tinkering with or pressing, right? And you get a good sense of what makes somebody quote unquote polar in a particular function. For example, excuse me, I'm going to sneeze here. There we go. Sorry. Apologize for sneezing. Um, Anyways, but he does a really good job of nailing the polar function, especially on particular types of functions, like any, if somebody's any polar, it's like you see enough of that, like enough ISFPs get typed or ISTPs, and you just see the brick wall when they're given any polar task. And I don't know how to explain it, but you see it. You see it. And so you start getting this vibe of like almost within the first 5 minutes, you could tell the ISFPs, they're very quiet. They have a hard time answering the questions because again, I think they're trying to find out, they're trying to think of the right answer or what's the best answer. And that's just that FI going, like a mile a minute, trying to figure out like, okay, what's the best answer here? Like what's, as opposed to just giving a answer, they're trying to come up with the best answer. Like, that's sort of my read of the situation. So they come across as very, very quiet, very hesitant to answer the questions, where you get an ESTP or an ESFP and they're just they'll just give you 20 different questions and have not think twice about, or 20 different answers and not think twice about it. And so not only do you get sort of the right brain vibe of the people, but you also get that left brain analytical, like you could see how the different functions react to different questions. And not only that, but like where they are in the stack, right? Like, are they sort of dominant? They sort of answer these questions with like, hardly any effort, or does it take some effort, but they're still able to do it, that kind of thing. The other thing is when you're doing the sort of analytical stuff, forget about all the, is this person TI Dom or is TI in the second slot? They're clearly, a TI type user, or at least it's in their front stack, but I don't know if it's first or second slot, or if, that's happening to you where you're like, oh, I know TI, I'm either an INTP or an ENTP. TI is in the first slot or second slot. Don't get hung up on all that stuff. Don't get hung up on the ordering, at least not right away. Like try to, instead, just try to figure out what the functions are doing. Like, again, go back to my video, the quick and dirty explanation of the functions, and just watch people. Like, what type of information are they being asked to process? What type of response or processing, cognitive processing, are they engaging in various scenarios, various activities, and how easy, does it come across, right? Um, and again, think of the context here. So if you're watching somebody who's an INTJ and they're giving you just sort of the standard MBTI video, here's the cognitive functions and here's what each function does. And here is the function order for the INTJ. Now they're giving you a very SI kind of lecture, right? They're not engaging in any of their NI or NE. They're not elaborating on anything. They're just sort of giving you sort of the rote information, right? Like here's the function order. Here's what it means to be an introvert versus an extrovert, or a thinker versus a feeler. Just all the stuff that they just sort of picked up along the way in a very SI way, right? So it's very easy to watch one of those videos and just come across being like, well, they must be an SJ, right? They're just doing SI stuff. They're just regurgitating. But that's the point of the video, right? They're just trying to regurgitate the SI information because they're just giving you the information that they picked up along the way using their SI experience, right? That's the context of the video. It doesn't make them an ISTJ or an ESFJ or whatever. It's just they're engaging in SI, and they can engage in it long enough to make their video, right? It's when you see them like interviewing people or talking to people and they're just sort of left to their own devices and they're not just sort of giving you a rote response about how MBTI works or how the cognitive functions stack up, but they're elaborating and you're seeing like are they engaging in a bunch of NE ideation, sort of all over the place, thinking of a lot of different things, or are they trying to like give you sort of the essence of how it works and being more NI about it? And so again, watch them in different contexts, right? Or are they doing a video like this where it's just any just all over the place? Now again, just because I make a lot of these sort of any type videos where I'm just talking about my ideas doesn't make me like a dominant any user or anything like that. It's just that's the context of this video. And I just don't have the time to make like one of those real INFJ videos with like the pretty graphics and the editing and all that kind of stuff. I just don't have the time for it. And I also don't know how to do that kind of stuff. And so, I'm left to just doing this any kind of stuff. But if you compare me to like an ENTP, like talking with famous people, I at least stay a little bit more on topic. But I do ramble, but I'm talking around an issue and trying to narrow, trying to circle around and narrow into the point I'm trying to make, as opposed to a real any user that's just like, oh, let's talk about this, let's talk about that, let's talk about this, let's talk about that. And they're not circling around and trying to focus in on a particular point. They're just like, oh, okay, this point connects to that point and that point connects to that point, and they're just, and you can sort of just skip through their video and just see they're all over the place. So that was a little any moment for me. I'm kind of all over the place, but now you can see I'm trying to bring us back to sort of the overall point of the video, whatever that is. And yeah, so be aware of the context, and also, but still try to figure out, okay, what function are they using? Do they seem to be comfortable with it? And do they seem to be comfortable in different scenarios, right? but then also watch, and again, this is all just sort of like, if this, maybe that, if this, maybe that. You're constantly toggling back and forth, and that's why it can be so frustrating for a lot of people who are starting, especially you TE users, or like dominant TE people, where you just want an answer, right? So I can move on and incorporate it into my process and then move on. Um, no, it's much more of a TI-NI thing, and that's why the INFJs just love this stuff, right? Because it's constantly parsing things out, and then using your TI and then using your NI to sort of come up with like a sort of a description of the way you think it works, and then going back to TI and saying, well, no, you got to factor in this variable. And then you go back to your NI and you say, okay, now I have a good description of what an INTP is. And then you come across an INTP that doesn't exactly match. And so you got to go back to your TI and reassess everything. And then you go back to, and it's that constant back and forth. And and I understand it can get really frustrating for people who just want an answer, right? But that's what I always say is, people are weird. People are inconsistent. And just because somebody, is an INTJ doesn't mean they're always going to act like an INTJ. And it doesn't mean that every INTJ in a particular situation is going to act like every other INTJ. It's not that cut and dried. And so you have to be okay with the nuance. You have to be okay with having competing thoughts in your head and sorting that out, right? Like figuring out how something appears to be contradictory or conflict with something else that you think to be true, and how do you resolve that. That is MBTI personality. This whole thing is trying to resolve those little nuances, and understand that there's some gray area where functions are going to overlap, or people are going to, you're going to get an INTJ who every once in a while tries to be engaging, and they don't come across as an INTJ, and you have to step back and say, okay, well, let's parse that out. What's the context here? Like, why are they being engaging when they're INTJs, right? But then you watch them long enough. Again, give it time. Just keep watching, because you'll start seeing that engaging kind of bubbly personality just start trickling out or trickling down, and then like the real INTJ starts coming out. Because again, they're trying to engage in maybe an FE behavior processing, but their brain is going to start tiring out, right? As opposed to the ESFJ or ENFJ that's just going to be FE the whole time, right? And you're not going to see it just sort of start trickling down, and another sort of personality emerging out of it. Okay, I've probably gone on long enough, and I'm sure there was things I was going to mention that I forgot about, and so that might be another video. But hopefully you got something out of this. I realize it was a big any rambling, but there should be some NI nuggets in there for you that maybe you can hang your hat on. And excuse me, if there's anything in particular you want me to elaborate on, or you want to push back on, certainly let me know in the comments. Happy to hear from you. Otherwise, have a good day or a good night.